My son-in-law and his brother dragged my pregnant daughter out onto the frozen surface of Lake Muskoka at 2 in the morning, cut a hole through the ice, and held her under until she stopped struggling. She was 26 weeks along when the OPP divers pulled her out 40 minutes later, blue, unconscious, somehow still drawing breath through a tube. I sat in that hospital corridor in Bracebridge and made one phone call to my younger sister in Halifax. I said 5 words to her. Bring everything you got left before I tell you what came after. If you've ever known what it feels like to watch your child be discarded by people who thought their money made them untouchable, please subscribe to Subtle Vengeance and leave a comment telling me which province or territory you're watching from. I read every one of them. The cottage party was supposed to be a goodwill thing. A reconciliation. That's what my son-in-law called it on the phone the week before. His name was Trevor Halloran Beaumont, and he came from one of those old Westmount families that owned a pulp and paper empire back when Quebec still ran on lumber, and who had spent the last 40 years quietly converting that money into commercial real estate across Toronto and Ottawa. His older brother, Pierce, ran the holding company. Their father, Lawrence Halloran Beaumont, sat on 3 corporate boards and had been shortlisted for the Senate twice under different governments. They had the kind of money that never showed up in newspapers, the kind that buys silence and judges and the right kind of forgetting. I'm Bernard Pelletier Whitcomb. I'm 67 years old. I spent 41 years as a structural engineer at a firm in Mississauga, designing bridges and overpasses across Ontario and the Maritimes. My wife, Annette, passed in 2009 from pancreatic cancer. Our daughter, Charlotte, was 19 when her mother died, just starting her 2nd year at Queen's. I raised her the rest of the way myself, badly some weeks and well enough others, and she grew up to be a kinder person than I ever managed to be. She finished her articling at a small firm in Kingston, became an environmental lawyer, and met Trevor at some charity gala in Yorkville 4 years ago. I knew the moment I shook that young man's hand at their engagement dinner that something inside him was hollow. He had the manners. He had the smile. But there was a flatness behind his eyes, the way a frozen lake looks calm right before it gives way under your boot. I never said a word against him. What father does that and keeps his daughter? I held my tongue and I watched. Charlotte called me on the 2nd Thursday of January. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She'd just come back from her doctor's appointment in Toronto. She was pregnant, 23 weeks already. She hadn't realized for a long time because of irregular cycles, she said, and the morning sickness had been mild. She told Trevor that night over dinner. He didn't say anything, just kept eating his pasta. Then he got up, went into his study, and called his father. She could hear them through the door. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the tone. It was the tone of 2 men discussing a problem. The next morning, Trevor came into the kitchen and acted like nothing had happened. He kissed her forehead. He told her he was thrilled. He suggested they go up to the family cottage on Lake Muskoka the following weekend, just him, her, his brother Pierce, and his brother's wife, to celebrate. A quiet getaway. Some maple syrup tapping, if the weather held. A real Canadian moment, he said. Charlotte phoned me right after he left for work. She told me she was scared. She didn't know why. I told her not to go. She said she'd already said yes, and Trevor would think she was crazy if she backed out now. I said I'd come too. I'd drive up Friday and stay at the lodge in Port Carling. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, please come, please." I drove up Friday afternoon in a snowstorm that had no business being that aggressive in late January, even by Muskoka standards, whiteout conditions on the 11 north of Barrie. I checked into a place called the Cedar Boughs Lodge, about 20 minutes from the Halloran Beaumont cottage, and called Charlotte to let her know I'd arrived. She told me to come for dinner the next night. Trevor had said it was fine, even though I could tell from her voice he hadn't meant it. Saturday evening I drove over. The cottage wasn't a cottage. It was a 6-bedroom timber frame compound with a separate boathouse and a heated guest cabin, sitting on a private bay with about 400 feet of shoreline. The lake was frozen solid by then, 2 weeks of -20 had locked it up like concrete. Trevor met me at the door with that smile of his, and Pierce shook my hand, the way wealthy men shake the hand of a guest they consider beneath them. Firm, brief, already looking past you toward the next thing. Pierce's wife, a thin, nervous woman named Sloane, barely made eye contact with me the entire evening. I think she knew. I think she'd known for a while. Charlotte was wearing a loose cream sweater that hid the bump. She'd gained almost no weight. She looked tired but happy to see me. We had dinner, venison that someone else had hunted, wine for the men, sparkling water for Charlotte. The conversation stayed shallow. The leaves. The cottage roof. The price of softwood lumber. After dinner, Lawrence, the father, arrived. I hadn't been told he was coming. He'd driven up from Toronto despite the weather, in a black Range Rover with a driver. He came through the door shaking snow off his coat, gave Charlotte a hug that lasted half a second too long, and then turned to me with a look I didn't like one bit. "Bernard," he said, "I didn't realize you'd be joining us. Charlotte invited me." Of course she did. Of course. Around 10:30, Charlotte excused herself to use the washroom upstairs. I stayed in the great room with Lawrence and the two brothers, nursing a whiskey I had no intention of finishing. Pierce got up and went into the kitchen. Trevor followed a minute later. Lawrence stayed by the fire, watching me. I felt something cold settle into my stomach, the kind of feeling I used to get on a job site when a load calculation didn't add up, and I knew, before I checked the math, that something was about to fail. I excused myself to find a washroom. I took the long way through the kitchen instead of the hallway. The kitchen was empty. The sliding door to the back deck was open, a thin line of cold air pouring in across the floor. I went to the door. I saw 3 figures out on the ice. The cottage's flood lamps lit maybe 60 feet of the bay, and beyond that was darkness. Trevor and Pierce were walking on either side of Charlotte. They each had an arm. She was barefoot. She was wearing only that cream sweater and her jeans. No coat, no boots. They were walking her out toward a spot maybe 40 yards from shore, where I could now see, in the harsh white light, a perfectly round black hole cut into the ice. An ice fishing hole. Freshly cut. Maybe 20 inches across. I started running. I am 67 years old. My left knee has a titanium pin in it from a fall off scaffolding in 1998, and I have never in my life moved faster than I moved across that frozen deck and down those wooden steps. I was screaming. I don't remember what. I heard my own voice, as if it belonged to a stranger. Lawrence caught me at the bottom of the steps. He was 72 years old, but he was a big man, 6'3", and he hit me across the face with a closed fist hard enough to put me on my back in the snow. I tasted copper. He stood over me, breathing through his nose like a horse. "Stay there, Bernard," he said. "Don't make this worse." I tried to get up. He kicked me in the ribs. I heard something crack. He bent down and dragged me by the collar back up onto the deck and zip-tied my wrists to the deck railing with a cable tie he pulled out of his coat pocket. He had brought it with him. He had brought it from Toronto. That detail is what undid me, eventually, more than anything else, not the violence, the premeditation. The man had packed a zip tie into his luggage, knowing what was going to happen that night. I screamed Charlotte's name across that frozen lake until my voice gave out. I saw what they did. I saw Trevor and Pierce force her down onto her knees at the edge of that hole. I saw Pierce push her head and shoulders down into the water. I saw her struggle. I saw her struggle. I saw her stop struggling. They held her under for what I later learned, from the OPP reconstruction, was approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then they let go and walked back across the ice toward the cottage. They didn't run. They walked. Sloane, the wife, came out onto the deck at some point. I don't know when. She saw me tied to the railing, my face bleeding, and she stopped dead. She looked at the men coming back across the ice. She looked at me, and then, God bless her, she ran back inside. And a moment later, I heard her on a phone in a voice that was not the voice of a woman who'd ever stood up for herself before in her life. She was calling 911. The OPP detachment in Bracebridge dispatched a unit within 4 minutes. The dive team out of Aurelia took longer. They had to break through the refrozen surface, which had already started to seal over the original hole because the ambient temperature had dropped to -26. They pulled Charlotte out at approximately 2047 in the morning. Her core temperature was 21 degrees Celsius. She had no detectable pulse for 11 minutes. They got her back. And they medevaced her by helicopter to Sunnybrook in Toronto because Bracebridge isn't equipped for that level of trauma. And somewhere over Lake Simcoe at 3:30 in the morning, her heart started beating on its own again. The baby was gone. They told me that around 6 a.m., a nurse with red hair and a kind voice and the sort of exhaustion in her face that I recognized from my own mother who'd been a nurse at the Royal Vic in the 70s. Charlotte's body had survived. Her son had not. He had been a boy. I hadn't known that. Charlotte had been waiting to tell me at the dinner. I sat in that hospital corridor for 2 hours before I could pick up my phone. I called my younger sister Genevieve. She lives in Halifax. She spent 28 years with the RCMP, the last 14 of those with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit out of Ottawa, before she requested a transfer back home. She retired in 2021 from the rank of detective sergeant. Genevieve and I hadn't spoken properly in almost 3 years. There had been a stupid argument at our cousin's funeral about the disposition of our late mother's silverware. I hadn't called her on her birthday. She hadn't called me on mine. The kind of estrangement that you let go on too long, because you both think there'll be time to fix it later. She picked up on the second ring. I told her where I was. I told her what had happened. I told her who had done it. There was a long silence on her end of the line. Then she said, very quietly, I am getting on the next flight to Toronto. Do not speak to their lawyers. Do not speak to the press. Do not speak to anyone but the OPP, and only with a lawyer of your own choosing in the room. I'll be there by supper time. Genevieve. Yes. They're going to bury this. Lawrence is going to make this go away. No, Bernard. He's not. She arrived at Sunnybrook at 6:42 that evening. She came in wearing a parka with frost on the collar, no makeup. Her hair iron gray now where it used to be auburn. She looked older than I'd remembered. We hugged in the hallway outside the ICU, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then she straightened up, wiped her eyes once, and got to work. The first thing the Heller and Beaumonts did was exactly what Genevieve had predicted. By Monday morning, a senior partner from a Bay Street firm called Dorrance, Pinson & Wakeham was in the hospital lobby asking to speak with me. He explained, in tones of immense professional sympathy, that the family was devastated by the tragic accident on the lake. That Charlotte had apparently gone outside in a state of distress, perhaps related to a hormonal episode, and had fallen through thin ice. That the family was, of course, fully cooperating with the OPP investigation. He suggested that any hasty statements I might make to investigators or media could expose me to defamation liability and would, frankly, only deepen everyone's pain. He said the family was prepared to make a substantial gesture of support. He used that exact phrase, substantial gesture of support, to assist with Charlotte's medical recovery and any other pressures I might be feeling. I let him finish. Then I said, "Get out of this hospital before I have you removed." He nodded once, very calmly, and left. Genevieve watched him go. She said, "He'll be back. They'll come at us 3 or 4 different ways before they figure out what works. Our job is to make sure nothing works." What Genevieve did over the next 11 months, I will not be able to describe in full because some of it was done through channels I'm not allowed to put words to. But I can tell you the shape of it. She started with Lawrence Heller and Beaumont's first wife. Her name was Vivienne. She had died in 1991 in what was reported as a riding accident at the family's horse farm outside Caledon. She had been thrown from a horse, hit her head on a stone fence post, and died at the scene before paramedics arrived. Vivienne had been 34 years old. The coroner who'd signed off on her death certificate was a man named Dr. Jean-Marc Tremblay, who had retired in 1999 and was now living in a long-term care facility in Trois-Rivières. Genevieve flew out to see him. He was 86 years old, lucid on his good days. She caught him on a good day. He told her, weeping, that the bruising pattern on Vivian Halloran Beaumont's body had been inconsistent with a fall from a horse, that there had been finger-shaped contusions on her upper arms, that her hyoid bone, while not fractured, had shown signs of pressure consistent with manual strangulation prior to the head injury. He had raised his concerns. He had been told, by his supervisor at the time, that the determination of accidental death had already been agreed upon. He had signed the certificate. He had never forgiven himself. He gave Genevieve a written, signed, witnessed statement. Then she found a woman named Dr. Orly Beauchamp, a partner at Lawrence's law firm in the late 90s, who had filed a sexual assault complaint against him in 1999. The complaint had vanished from the Toronto Police Service's records within 2 weeks. Dr. Beauchamp had received a settlement of $350,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. She had spent 26 years not talking about what Lawrence had done to her in his office on a Friday night in November of 1999. Genevieve sat with her in a coffee shop on Yonge Street for 4 hours. By the end of that conversation, Dr. Tupel Beauchamp said she was prepared to break the NDA on the record, in court, in public, anywhere it would matter. Then there was the financial side, and this is where my sister was. At her best, she and a forensic accountant friend of hers from the RCMP days went through the public filings of the Halloran Beaumont Holding Company. They found a pattern of donations to a federal political action committee that exceeded Elections Canada limits by what appeared to be a factor of 7. They found offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda registered to numbered companies that traced back, through 4 layers of shell, to Lawrence personally. They found that Trevor, my son-in-law, was the beneficiary of a trust that would mature on his 40th birthday in October of the following year, and that the trust was worth approximately $78 million. The trust contained a clause that I had not known existed. If Trevor was married at the time of maturation and subsequently divorced, his spouse was entitled to 40% of the corpus, plus child support pegged to the trust's annual yield. Charlotte had told Trevor she was pregnant on a Thursday. By the following Saturday night, they had walked her out onto the ice. The math was not difficult. Genevieve went to a journalist she trusted at the Globe and Mail. A woman named, a woman who had once written a series on RCMP corruption that had cost 3 commissioners their jobs. She would not be intimidated by Bay Street lawyers. The first article ran on a Tuesday in early March under the headline, Questions Surround Death of Halloran Beaumont Heiress in 1991. It was followed 3 days later by a second article on the firm's offshore holdings. A week after that, a third article appeared. This one focused on Dr. Beauchamp's allegations. Lawrence held a press conference. He stood at a podium in the lobby of his Bay Street tower and called the allegations a coordinated political smear by enemies of his family. He invoked his late wife. He invoked his dedication to public service. He looked composed. He looked believable. Nobody believed him. The retired guest from the cottage that night, Pierce's wife, Sloane, came forward with a sworn affidavit describing what she had seen and heard. She had filed for divorce from Pierce within 48 hours of the incident. She testified that Trevor and Pierce had been planning the killing for at least a week. She had overheard them discussing the timing. She had seen Lawrence arrive at the cottage with the zip ties. The OPP investigation was quietly taken out of the Bracebridge Detachment's hands and assigned to a major case unit out of Aurelia, with oversight from the Ministry of the Attorney General. The Crown laid charges. 3 weeks later, Trevor and Piers Halloran Beaumonts were charged with attempted murder, criminal negligence causing bodily harm, unlawful confinement, and this matters to me. This matters more than I can say. Crown prosecutors successfully argued for a charge of causing the death of a child before birth in the act of committing an offense under Section 238 of the Criminal Code. That charge had almost never been used in Canadian jurisprudence. The Crown attorney told us privately that she had been waiting her entire career for a case that justified it. She got. I've thought a great deal, in the years since that night on Lake Muskoka, about why things unfolded the way they did. People want to believe that monsters like the Halloran Beaumonts are caught by accident, by some lucky break, by a witness in the right place at the right time. The truth is colder than that, and in some ways more hopeful. Trevor and his father were caught because they had spent 40 years assuming that men like me would not fight back, and women like my sister Genevieve would not remember how to follow a paper trail. They mistook quiet for weakness. That single error in judgment, repeated across 2 generations of a family, was the load-bearing flaw in the whole structure of their lives. Everything else collapsed from there. I think a lot now about cause and effect. The night Lawrence packed a zip tie into his luggage was the night the case against him began to assemble itself, even though no one knew it yet. The morning Trevor called his father instead of holding his pregnant wife's hand was the morning he chose his own ending. Charlotte didn't put them in prison. I didn't put them in prison. They put themselves there, the way a man who keeps building on rotten timber eventually puts himself through the floorboards. We just made sure the inspector showed up. What I want to say to anyone listening, especially the young ones, especially the ones who feel small in the face of people with money and titles, is this. Character is not built in the moment of crisis. It's built in the ordinary years, the unglamorous decades, when nobody is watching and nobody is keeping score. I spent 41 years being honest in small ways, filing reports correctly, telling clients when their budgets wouldn't bear what they wanted built, going to my daughter's school plays when I was tired. None of it felt heroic at the time. None of it felt like preparation. But when the moment came that demanded everything I had, patience, integrity, the will to keep going, I had it. Because I had been quietly making it for 40 years. The Halloran Beaumonts had been making something else for just as long. They had been making the assumption that they were exempt. That assumption is a kind of cancer. It eats the part of a person that knows how to imagine someone else's pain. By the time Trevor walked Charlotte out onto that ice, he wasn't capable anymore of seeing her as anything but a problem on a balance sheet. That isn't strength. That's the worst kind of weakness there is. If you take anything from what I've shared, take this. Be a person of your word in small things, so you can be a person of your word in the great ones. Sharpen your mind on ordinary problems, so it's ready when an extraordinary one finds you. And never confuse a quiet life with an empty one. The patient ones are not the powerless ones. We're just the ones who haven't needed to move yet. When we do, the ground tends to remember it.